one of the Senior Compliance Managers with Legal Eye, and I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you to the fifth in our Compliance Bytes Emerging Risk series of webinars, which today focuses on remote or agile working and the benefits of this type of working, and also the risks that firms need to be alert to prior to setting out on this path. Before I get started on this increasingly important subject, just to let you know we have slightly changed the method of presenting our webinars, and so today's session is pre-recorded, which means I'm not able to take questions in the way one usually could during or at the end of a webinar. However, don't worry, if you do have a question either as the webinar progresses or at the end, my contact details are on the final slide, and if you have any questions, please do feel free to either email or call me, as I'm more than happy to take questions. So let's have a look at our agenda for today. So firstly, I'm going to look at remote or agile working, as it's sometimes called, which is an innovative way of working. I'm going to be looking with you at the benefits and also the risks of remote working. Then I'm going to take you through a case study, and there are 3 questions that we'll be looking at around the case study. And then finally, I want to have a look at policies, procedures and plans. I want to start today by putting this webinar on remote or agile working into context, and the context is quite simply looking at whether remote working is an innovation that will enable you as a firm to become more competitive within the legal market. Firms are being encouraged by the regulators to be more innovative in the way in which they provide legal services. We are told that only 1 in 10 people or small businesses ask a solicitor or a barrister for help, and that the 2 main barriers that prevent people seeking legal help are lack of information and then also perception of high costs in accessing legal services, with 83% of small businesses believing that services will be unaffordable. Now, you all know far better than I do how competitive the market is at the moment, and there's increasing pressure from the regulators to publish prices and details of complaints, and conversely pressure from clients who, with access to the internet, shop around for the best prices, just as they would do for their weekly shopping. And you as law firms sit in the middle there, so you have top-down pressure from the regulators and bottom-up pressure from clients. So innovation in the way that you as law firms work is an absolute must to enable you to stay competitive, because, as I've said, there is increasing competition in the marketplace and clients have higher expectations, so firms need to find ways to maximise revenue and productivity whilst minimising costs, but at the same time ensuring that the client care doesn't suffer, to enable you to differentiate yourselves in the market from your competitors. There are very many ways in which law firms can differentiate themselves in the market. If you look at the report that the SRA published at the end of June this year, called Improving Access, Tackling Unmet Legal Needs, you'll see many suggestions, including things like unbundling of legal services, and if that is something you're thinking about exploring, the Law Society have produced an excellent practice note, which includes recent case law and also a precedent client care letter, but also things like changes to the separate business rules, which means that law firms can now be connected to businesses that offer non-reserved legal services, more fixed fees, outsourcing, and AI or artificial intelligence. So just a few of the ways of differentiating yourselves. Of course, there's been quite a bit recently in the press about the new codes of conduct that will be coming out next year, which are intended to create a more open, modern and competitive legal services sector that works in the best interests of the public, with shorter codes, so one for individual solicitors and one for firms, and we're told a simplified accounts code. So interesting times lie even further ahead in the ways solicitors may be working in the future. But today I want to focus on just one area, which is remote working. And so if you're listening to me today, it's hopefully because you have some interest in understanding a little more about the benefits and also, of course, the risks of remote working and how remote working could work for you as a firm. I am a firm believer in the saying, if it's not broke, don't fix it. But equally, I don't believe that firms can bury their collective heads in the sand and not look at innovative ways of working to help them work smarter, not necessarily harder, but smarter. And therefore ensuring that they are at the forefront when it comes to being one of the go-to firms in the marketplace. So many firms are now enabling their fee earners and non-fee earning staff to work remotely. Some firms have made the transition or even set up as virtual firms, whereas other firms allow staff members to work remotely, some full-time, some part-time, some in a very structured way, and some more flexibly or on an ad hoc needs basis. Now, there's lots of research and papers that have been published about remote working. Some relate to the legal industry and some don't, but there is overwhelming support for the fact that there are many benefits to remote working. And so today I just want to look at a few with you. So top of that list there on your screen is increased staff morale and work-life balance. Many virtual firms confirm that staff are happier and more motivated, and this can often be because staff have increased flexibility in terms of their working hours, which of course can also have a positive effect for clients who are able to reach staff when they need to and not just during what's considered to be normal office hours. Having happy staff can't be underestimated. Maintaining a strong, committed and motivated workforce is key because staff are a firm's greatest asset. Of course, happier and more motivated staff in turn leads to improved productivity and then in turn to increased profitability for the firm, or perhaps it enables you as a firm to price more competitively and thus to increase your client base. Enabling staff to work remotely some or all of the time means that staff who for whatever reason can no longer commit to full-time office working can be retained, which allows them to meet their full potential, and also the firm benefit from retaining trusted members of the team. And of course, this is also true for attracting talent. There may be individuals who want to work but aren't able to commit to either full-time working or office-based working, but could commit to remote working. Levels of client satisfaction are often increased because staff are happier and more motivated, and with flexibility in working hours comes the opportunity to schedule meetings when it's convenient, not just to the worker but also to the client. So that may well be outside of what's considered to be normal office hours, and satisfied clients are clients that are more likely to return when they require legal advice or assistance, and also of course more likely to recommend your firm to their family, to their friends and to work colleagues. Agile working very often means reducing costs and overheads and enabling staff to work smarter. Very often in firms, a proportion of the desk or office space is not utilised at any given time. This might be, for example, due to holidays. It could be members of staff being off sick. It could be that certain members of staff are visiting clients on quite a regular basis, or perhaps staff have left, whatever the reason, but that office space costs money and it's not always needed. Some firms will hot desk, so have a small hub of desks that employees can use if they need to, but primarily those staff are remotely based, and this has a significant impact on reduction in cost. So just a few of the key benefits there, and there are many more, whether members of staff work remotely all the time or all members of staff, or whether just a proportion work remotely some of the time. As there are benefits, there are risks, but these risks can be mitigated and have been mitigated very successfully for very many firms who have staff that work remotely. It's just really a case of being alert to these risks and ensuring that you have steps in place to mitigate or remove the risks before remote working starts. So some of you listening today will already have staff that work remotely, and some of you will have thought about the risks surrounding this, whilst others will have this as perhaps a more informal arrangement. So perhaps a member of staff phones in, their car's broken down, or one of their children is off school, and therefore the risks haven't necessarily been considered. You may be in that situation, the work needs to be done and you approve home working, but you don't think about the risks, and that could be the one opportunity that, for example, a hacker needs to access your systems. So remote working, as I've mentioned, takes many forms, and you may all engage in a degree of remote working without really realizing it, and importantly, without risk assessing that work. So let's have a look on the screen now at what could be classed as remote working. So having access to and checking your work emails on your mobile amounts to remote working. Making calls whilst in a public place, at a conference or a seminar, perhaps on the train or in a coffee shop where those calls can be overheard. Working on your laptop on a train or again in a coffee shop whilst connected to an open Wi-Fi amounts to remote working and is potentially very risky. Perhaps you're reading papers on a train whilst travelling to or from the office or to or from a meeting, taking files home or emailing documents to your home PC to work on at home, and meetings out of the office. So they're all types of remote working, and that's remote working in a more informal way rather than perhaps a formal way where people work away from the office on a regular basis. I'd like to look now at a case study which illustrates some of the issues and risks in relation to remote working. I'm going to read the case study out to you. It'll be on your screens in a few moments. But whilst I'm doing so, have a think about three areas. So firstly, when you're thinking about remote working, what legislation needs to be considered? Now, obviously, there's a lot of legislation, a lot of factors to consider, so things like health and safety. But I'm primarily thinking for today's purposes about two areas relating to compliance. Then have a think about the potential risks of remote working. And then finally, what policies and procedures do you as a firm need to have in place in relation to remote working to ensure that you as a firm are mitigating as far as possible, or even eliminating, if that's possible, the risk. So I'm going to look now at the case study, which you'll see on your screens there. So you are the risk partner in a medium-sized firm, and you've recently been successful in tendering for new work, and as a result you've taken on several new members of staff. Some of them are experienced lawyers, others aren't. The firm are considering a move to bigger offices, as space was an issue even before the new staff were taken on, but remote working has been mentioned as a possible solution to keep overheads down whilst the work is relatively new and consideration is given to larger premises and relocation. You've been asked to prepare a report to the board of directors highlighting the increased risks to client confidentiality, to information management and security, and also to data protection arising from agile or remote working. So what issues need to be considered? So again, if you just remember, there were three areas I asked you to look at. Firstly, two areas of legislation, then in relation to risks, and then in relation to policies, plans and procedures. So firstly, in terms of the legislation relating to compliance, there is the code of conduct. So it doesn't matter which code, whether you are regulated by the SRA or the CLC, you must act in the best interests of each client at all times. You must also provide a proper standard of service to your clients. You're required to run your business effectively and in accordance with proper governance and sound financial and risk management principles, and also to protect client monies and assets. Both codes also have sections in them relating to client confidentiality and disclosure. So you're required to keep the affairs of your clients confidential, and also you have a duty to maintain client confidentiality. So in terms of considerations relating to remote working, you need to consider any increased risk to client confidentiality and how to mitigate those risks effectively. In terms of management of your business, then under the SRA code, under Chapter 7 or under Principle 2 of the CLC code, you're required as a firm to have effective systems and controls in place to identify, monitor and manage risks. So that's any risks, and therefore remote working would be one of those risks. You must have adequate systems in place for supervising client matters, to include the regular checking of the quality of work by suitably competent and experienced people, and you must also have clear and effective governance structures and reporting lines. And of course, you are also required to comply with the legislation that's applicable to your business, including, for example, the data protection legislation. So when you're considering remote or agile working, there's a duty on you to ensure you have the required systems and the required controls in place to identify, monitor and manage the risks. And some of these risks are different from the risks associated with office work. Supervision, governance and clear reporting lines are very important with remote working because there's a physical distance between an employee and a supervisor or head of department. And so very clear standards need to be set out and adhered to, and also monitored to ensure that they're being adhered to, and expectations set out both on both sides, so both the employee and the employer. In terms of data protection, shortly, less than 10 months away now, we're going to be looking at the General Data Protection Regulations rather than the Data Protection Act as is the legislation at the moment. And you'll have a responsibility, you do currently have a responsibility to protect personal information that you and your firm collect and use, and you must ensure appropriate security measures are in place to prevent it being accidentally or deliberately compromised. Of course, one of the main things we hear about the General Data Protection Regulations is the increased fines for data breaches. But if you do have, or you are thinking about remote workers, then you also need to include within your considerations a data map in preparation for the General Data Protection Regulations. And this needs to include who has access to data, where it's stored. So, for example, you may have hard copies and soft copies, and you must also ensure that you have mechanisms in place to adhere to the wishes of a data subject should they require, for example, rectification of the data you hold, or perhaps even erasure, since you need to be confident that you know where all your data resides and can carry out the wishes of a data subject within the required 30 days. So if you are considering remote working, then you do need to think about where your data will reside and include that in a data map for the purposes of the General Data Protection Act. But you may also wish to undertake a data protection impact assessment first to show in terms of the General Data Protection Regulations that you are complying. So moving on to the next question, and second question, which was about the potential risks from agile or remote working. And I want to look with you at two types of risks. There are a lot more risks, but I want to look at two types of risks, which are cyber risks and also paper and personnel risks. So firstly, in relation to cyber risks, let's have a look at a few areas. Mobile phones Do you or any of your employees have access to your work emails on your personal mobile phones? And if so, is the necessary antivirus software installed? Is your phone password protected? Do you, as a firm, have the facility to either remotely disable or wipe the content of the mobile phone if it's either lost or stolen? Do you as a firm know how many of your employees have email access to their work emails on their mobile phones? And what controls do you have in place to monitor this? So those things you need to think about in relation to mobile phones. In relation to computers or laptops, again, another risk. If you have or are looking at members of staff working remotely, then you need to consider, will they be using a work laptop or their own laptop or computer to carry out the remote work? If it's the latter, then consideration needs to be given to things like, do they have sufficiently robust firewalls and virus checkers? Do they have an operating system which is set up to receive automatic updates? Do they regularly download the latest patches or security updates to cover any vulnerabilities? Do they have anti-spyware and anti-malware protection installed? Regular backups of work must be taken. What do you consider as a firm to be a regular backup? And how are you going to ensure that they regularly back up in accordance with your policy? Encryption, do they have full disk encryption or file encryption for confidential information? And do they on their devices adhere to your password policy? So are devices password protected? Is it a strong password? Is it changed regularly? Is it does it comply with your password or information management policy? Also Wi-Fi, so if you do have individuals that are considering or are working remotely, do you know about their Wi-Fi? Are they operating over a secured Wi-Fi, or is it an open Wi-Fi, which is potentially a huge risk for the firm? The second aspect you can see there in the second column is what I call the paper or the personnel risks from remote working. So in any circumstances where you're considering remote working, consideration should be given to the seniority of the individual working away from the office, because trust and accountability is key for successful remote working. But also, as mentioned earlier, the Code of Conduct requires you to have adequate systems in place for supervising client matters and also clear and effective reporting lines. So these are key considerations before a member of staff commences remote working. Secondly, you'll see their paper files. Do you have a login, log out system? So at any given time, you know exactly where files are, particularly if the SRA or CLC wanted to see them. Think about the transporting of files home. Very simple steps can be put in place, which must be adhered to. So, for example, if you're carrying a client file in your arms with the name on the outside of the file, that's a potential breach of client confidentiality. We've all heard of the cases of client files being left on the bus or the train, leaving them in your briefcase in the luggage rack on a train and they're stolen, leaving them in the boot of your car whilst you pop into the supermarket or the corner shop for some milk or collect the children from nursery on the way home. If your car's broken into, your car's stolen, then you have a breach of confidentiality and you have real issues there. So you do need effective procedures in place to anticipate and prevent these breaches of client confidentiality when you are thinking about or looking at remote working. Another area is shredding of working papers. What do you do, or what are your instructions to staff members who work remotely in relation to scraps of paper that you or they jot client details down on? Are they required to shred all paper that has client identifiers on at home? Does their home shredder comply with the firm's requirements in your information security policy? Are staff aware that under the new general data protection regulations that are coming in, that client data includes anything from which a client can be identified? So it could be that telephone number on a scrap of paper or an address. So these must all be disposed of securely to prevent a data breach. Home security, so if you have a remote worker that has paper files, how are those paper files stored at home? Are they in locked cabinets? Are they in a locked office? Who has access? Who has keys to that locked cabinet or that locked office? Do you allow remote workers to print at home, or are they only allowed to print to the office? Do you allow headed paper to be taken off the premises? And if so, do you monitor that? How many pieces of paper are taken? What happens to those? Are they securely locked away? And also your PII insurance. You should check your requirements. Similarly with your cyber insurance, check the requirements of your policies to ensure that actions taken are not invalidating any cover. Also, what about meetings with clients? Whether you're a remote worker or a virtual firm, or indeed if you're not, you may meet clients away from the office. So you are in those circumstances working as a remote worker. So think about confidentiality. Think about your surroundings. Are you in an area where other people can hear a conversation you're having? It may be on the telephone, it may be with somebody you're meeting with. That could amount to a potential breach of confidentiality if you're discussing confidential matters. You may be seeing a witness who may be talking about things, not have the awareness of confidentiality that you have, and can be overheard. Think about your laptop on a train or in a coffee shop. We all work on the move now. Almost everybody has a mobile phone, can quite easily take a picture, a snapshot of your screen on their mobile phone camera, and completely without you knowing, and that is a breach of confidentiality. Don't leave your laptop, even if you're only popping to the loo or popping to get a coffee on the train. Don't leave your laptop, take it with you. Also, and we've all been here, talking loudly on the train with a colleague is a breach of client confidentiality. And again, all of these things are not limited to remote or agile workers that work formally away from the office. These could be any of us travelling to or from meetings. So the final question on our case study relates to policies and procedures that you need to have in place to mitigate the risks of remote working and ensure that you gain the many benefits that there are to be had. So I think if you can manage the risks, there are very many benefits, as I've already mentioned, in relation to remote working, but it's just ensuring that the people who are working remotely know the parameters within which to work. So things which you'd expect to be there: email policy, internet usage policy, information management and security policy, data protection policy, cyber security policy, a remote workers policy, flexible workers policy, and a risk register, as well as a remote workers risk assessment form and training and awareness. So prior to agreeing to agile working, workers should be asked to complete a remote workers risk assessment form, which considers all of the matters that we've talked about today and confirms adherence to all of the policies and procedures. That form is then signed by the individual to confirm that they do adhere to those particular things, and failure to comply with that, because that would potentially be very serious, may lead to disciplinary action. You also need to ensure that you document any issues in relation to remote working in your risk register, because then you will be able to see trends or gaps. You'll be able to evaluate, monitor these, and then make improvements as necessary. Most importantly, I think, is training of staff to ensure that they're aware of the risks, because if staff understand the risks and also understand the codes of conduct within which they and the firm are required to operate, then they're more likely to adhere to them, because they have a good grasp of why they're being asked to do a particular thing. So that's pretty much it from me today on the benefits and risks of remote working. You'll appreciate that in 25 to 30 minutes, it's not really possible to go into huge depth on each and every aspect. However, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is an ever-changing legal landscape, and whilst we're told that regulation is reducing, I think certainly the lengths of the proposed codes are, there does seem to be increasing pressure on firms to reduce costs but still provide the same high level of service. Many firms are offering advice and services cheaper, and to remain competitive, firms do need to think outside of the box a little. And one of the ways to reduce overheads is to consider remote working, and considered carefully, weighing up the risks involved is just one of the ways to ensure that you will stay in front of the competition. I appreciate you may have questions, and as I said at the very beginning, I'm very happy to take any questions by telephone or by email. My contact details are on the screen there, so do please feel free to contact me. Legal Eye's website is also on the screen there, so please do take a look at our website, and if we can assist you in any way with any aspect of compliance, from file reviews to accreditation with Excel or CQS or the Wills and Inheritance Quality Standard, or just helping you generally with compliance, then do please email or call me for a chat. Very happy. I hope that you found today's webinar interesting. If you have, please do visit our website and have a look at the other topics in our Emerging Risk series. Some of our previous webinars are on the website if you want to listen to them. We've done webinars on GDPR, on the new money laundering regulations, also on vulnerable clients, and also on cybersecurity. And there's a list of the upcoming webinars, with the next one in a couple of weeks talking about the competence statement for solicitors. So once again, all that remains for me to say is thank you for listening.